The Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com is brought to you by Pride Seeds, Safina Insecticide, and Cruiser Max Vibrance Beans.
Bernard Tobin here on the Soybean School, joined today by Omafra soybean specialist Horst Bohner. Horst, how's it going?
Very well, thanks for the invitation.
Hey, great to have you. As I say, I wish we were doing this out in the field, but we're not going to get that done today, but hopefully we'll get there pretty soon. But hey, I know growers have been out in the field. It's and getting antsy, getting going. Want to talk about planting soybeans, and if I go back to 2019, we learned that you can plant late and still get a good crop. It's April 15th. It's cool, but it's dry. How early can we plant soybeans?
And it really is a good question, right? And we have had a lot of interest over the winter, and there's quite a movement in the U.S. as well to push planting dates earlier. And you hear some of these reports of big soybean yields with early planting. So I think we need to think first a little bit about the potential benefits. Why would you do that, right? And some of the obvious ones are just around getting more yield. And why is that? Well, because you're extending the growing season into the fall, or into the spring rather, right? And then you're going to try and also extend it into the fall with a longer season bean. But the whole idea, of course, is that you get more nodes on that plant before it starts to flower. So maybe as many as 6 trifoliates before it starts to flower, and that's what we think is ideal. So that's one way that we can increase yield, by getting more nodes before it flowers. But the other neat thing is that we know that soybeans flower earlier when you plant them earlier, right? We talk a lot about the photoperiod effect, but the simple truth is if you plant April 20th, those beans will flower significantly earlier, 5, maybe as much as a week earlier, 5 days to a week earlier compared to a May 10th kind of planting. So that's good, of course, especially if you've also chosen a long day bean, because then you've extended the flowering period, which equals more pods per acre, right? Those kind of things lead us to having a good theoretical reason why early planting works. And then practically, we've done some trials across North America. Many of us have tried this, and it does work, relatively early planting, to get us a few more bushels. The other neat thing about this is there's some other things coming up that have come up that are also worth thinking about. For one, if you get the canopy closed, right, you get more sun earlier, that's good, but you also cool the soil temperature. Not by a lot, but by a few degrees. And we know that end fixation through those nodules works better when the soil is cool, when it's below 25 degrees Celsius. So we have that data to show that if you have a full canopy earlier, a little bit cooler soil. So there's some good real reasons that it should work.
And I know our friend Peter Johnson is always excited that obviously you plant early and might get those soybeans off a little earlier, and he can plant his winter wheat. He always gets excited about that as well. I want to talk about some of the risks, and the first thing that comes to mind to me, Horst, if you plant really early, will you finish too early and maybe miss some of those August rains that we like to say make grain?
It can happen for sure, and that's why we've really gone to try and push the conversation to also including the idea of a long season bean, right? Because then you're taking advantage of both the early and the late part of the season, like I mentioned. Absolutely. We have found that when we did these studies way back in 2009 to 2012, we had some great yields from mid-April planting in 2009. And then in 2010, it didn't really work out that well. And what we learned is that you need to, you can, if August is really dry, right, and those beans finish up before the rains come in the first part of September, if that's how it works out that year, you've actually hurt yourself a little bit. So it can happen for sure. And it doesn't always happen, but that whole idea of trying to mitigate the risk by growing a long day bean seems to help that a little bit. And of course, the real issue, of course, with very early planting is that you reduce plant stands usually, right? It's just it's a tough environment for that little plant. And now you're putting soybeans into temperatures that might be 5-6 degrees and stay there for a week. Remember that soybeans like 28 degrees Celsius for soil temperature. So think about what you're doing there. And obviously you're reducing stands, and that's a significant issue if it gets below let's say 100,000 plants per acre.
What about chilling and insects? A couple of other considerations.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So the more you shock that little seed early on, like let's say you plant and you get a cold rain on top of it, that is the worst case scenario. We have seen that inhibitional chilling injury that can happen in both corn and especially soybeans. So that's why we say it's okay to plant into cool conditions, but if there's a cold rain coming, we would try to avoid it. And obviously, the cooler the soil, the longer it stays in the ground, the more opportunity for both diseases and insects to really attack that seed. So a good seed treatment package, we would suggest, is the right thought process. The way I would kind of encapsulate our modern thinking on this issue is basically the window to plant soybeans is the same window we would suggest you should plant corn into. So really we've moved away from you should plant corn first, then move to soybeans. It's not a terrible strategy by any stretch, but from a soybean perspective, I would suggest that the window is the exact same window. If it's fit for corn, you should be planting soybeans too.
Right. Hey, it's April 15th. And farmers are out there trying to figure out what they should do. What do you tell them to do over the next couple of weeks? I think the first thing is probably keeping an eye on the weather forecast.
Well, when I looked at the forecast just this morning, and of course this week looks very cool, temperatures of maybe up to 5 and then nighttime temperatures down to -3, -4. I don't think it makes any sense on the 15th of April to be planting soybeans. With those kind of temperatures, the risk is just higher than the reward. But having said that, you look at the weekend temperature, maybe up to 10, 12, above freezing for nighttime temperatures. Yeah, I think there's an opportunity there to plant some of your soybeans. But this is kind of a risk to reward thought process. And what I mean by that is, if you've got 1,000 acres of soybeans to plant, nothing wrong with planting 300 of those on the 20th of April. I think that makes total sense. Would I plant 1,000 acres? I wouldn't do it. I think that we have enough, as you mentioned right off the beginning, what we learned last year, the window to plant soybeans and get a good crop is surprisingly large some years, right?
Yeah, and everybody's got the gear, and we don't need a big window. Hopefully we'll have larger windows than last year.
Well, that's right. It's the 15th, right? We certainly have a month, and we're still within, I would consider, anything before the 15th of May early. It's not ultra early, but it's still a relatively early good time for so many of us to be planting soybeans. So there's certainly lots of time out there, yeah.
So, Horst, I hear more and more people talking about, whether we should plant deeper when we go early. Any thoughts on that?
It's an interesting thought process, isn't it? And the reasoning would be that with early planting, you have more fluctuations in temperature, right? Let's say the temperature gets up to 10 degrees and you've got some black dirt there. Maybe the soil temperature in the top inch or so goes to even 14 degrees. And that very night, it goes down to -5. Well, obviously, that's a huge swing, and that's hard on seed, right? It's hard on vigor. And so the concept would be, even if you just go a little bit deeper, 1.5 inches, maybe 1.75 inches, more of a normal kind of planting depth for soybeans, or maybe even a little deeper, 2 inches, you can avoid some of those swings, right? And you get a more even emergence because of that. Personally, I have a really hard time recommending that for soybeans. Corn, I think we have some good evidence that makes sense for very early planted corn. For soybeans, my big issue every time I plant soybeans early, and we certainly have tried, the biggest problem is just getting them out of the ground, right? And so you come back to, if you put them in shallow, you're more likely to see them again, right? So let's put it this way. If it's no-till, because we have less of that fluctuation, I think an inch is lots if you're planting on the 18th of April, to be honest with you. And an inch into the soil is good. Now, if it's black dirt and you've got more of this potential up and down, maybe you should go more of a normal planting depth. But this is one of those areas maybe we need to do a little more research to try and figure that out. Personally, like I said, I'm really afraid of digging in soybeans too deep when it's before May 1st, because I just want to see them again, right?
Well, Horst, hey, great stuff. Great to catch up with you, sir. Thanks for stopping by. And as I say, hopefully we'll see you in a field next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you again for the invitation. Take care.